Something about the answer you have been waiting for may already feel strangely familiar, as though your mind has been circling around it long before you could consciously understand what it was trying to tell you. Imagine carrying a sealed letter for weeks, knowing instinctively that whatever is inside matters, yet finding yourself unable to open it because some deeper part of you senses that you are not quite ready to understand its language. That is the emotional atmosphere surrounding the sky right now. Today, Sunday, Mercury finally leaves Cancer and enters Leo, ending more than 2 months of inward, repetitive, emotionally charged reflection. Cancer kept Mercury moving through private chambers of memory and feeling, while Leo gives that accumulated inner experience something it has been missing, a voice. Yet this is where you need to pay close attention, because the message associated with this shift may not arrive through another person at all. You may not receive the text, phone call, email, or dramatic announcement you have imagined. Instead, the revelation may happen when you suddenly hear yourself saying something you have only been capable of feeling until now. That changes the central question completely. Rather than asking when the message will arrive, ask yourself what it has actually been trying to communicate and why you still experience yourself as someone who is waiting. What you are missing is not necessarily new information. The shape of the answer has been developing inside you for weeks. Perhaps you have repeatedly reconstructed a conversation while driving, rehearsed words in your mind that never became an actual message, or sensed a choice gradually becoming undeniable while still being unable to speak that choice aloud. That state of almost knowing is not meaningless uncertainty. It is the final stage of converting emotion into language. Remember that distinction, because it becomes essential to understanding everything that follows. This kind of message rarely reveals itself in a neat sequence. Often, the painful fragment becomes visible first, while the part that eventually explains its purpose appears later. There is a reason for that, and we will return to it. For now, recognize that the sky has spent this week clearing room for precisely this transition. A few days ago, the waning moon in Taurus asked you to release something you had outgrown, perhaps a position you were defending, a familiar comfort, or an explanation that could no longer contain who you have become. Shortly before that, Chiron turned retrograde in Taurus, bringing an old and deeply personal wound back into a period of reconsideration. Meanwhile, Leo season has been gathering strength. The Sun and Jupiter are already there, and Mercury is now the final piece preparing to cross into that territory. So the real issue is no longer whether something will happen. Something already has. What matters now is what occurs when a truth you have privately lived finally acquires language strong enough to be heard by another person. The reason the message feels late is that the experience came before the explanation. That is what separates this Mercury ingress from the many ordinary sign changes Mercury makes throughout a year. Mercury did not simply pass quickly through Cancer. It remained there through its stationary period, its retrograde movement, and its return to direct motion, spending more than 2 months revisiting the same emotional territory. This was less like passing through a room and more like living there. After such an extended stay, what comes out is unlikely to be a random thought. It is much closer to a conclusion. Today, Sunday the 9th, Mercury enters Leo. But before leaving Cancer completely, from the final degree of Cancer, it makes one last adjustment aspect with the North Node. That adjustment brings together 2 realities that do not naturally communicate in the same way, yet now have to respond to one another. Hidden inside that contact is an important caution. The emotional language you relied on while processing these experiences cannot simply be carried unchanged into what comes next. Your delivery has to evolve. The people capable of hearing you may be different. Even the frame through which you explain what happened may need to change. Imagine that you have privately filled a journal for 2 months and are suddenly asked to read 1 sentence from it aloud. You are not being asked to expose every page. You only need to identify the sentence containing the deepest truth. But you also cannot read it in the private voice you use when nobody else is listening. You have to speak it in the voice you use when being understood. Genuinely matters. As Mercury enters Leo, the moon is already in Cancer, meaning this emerging confidence does not step into emotionally neutral territory. It enters a space already crowded with memory, sensitivity, instinct, and the desire to protect what feels vulnerable. At its healthiest, this combination can produce genuine courage, the kind that allows you to speak clearly without abandoning your emotional truth. At its more difficult expression, however, vulnerability can disguise itself as theatrical certainty. Someone may speak louder, make the statement bigger, or intensify the delivery because underneath the performance lives a fear that ordinary words will not be taken seriously. This is the psychological threshold of the transit. You are being asked to recognize the difference between authentic self-expression and a defensive performance designed to protect something tender. To understand that difference, two assumptions need to be removed immediately. The first assumption is that the promised message must literally be a text. For some people, there absolutely may be a concrete message this week, including a text, an email, a phone call, or another piece of direct information. Mercury, entering Leo during this concentrated sequence of aspects, supports that possibility. But if you spend the next 7 days repeatedly checking your inbox and nothing appears, do not assume the transit somehow passed you by. The communication may be emerging internally rather than arriving externally, and the sky provides a specific reason for understanding it that way. Almost 2 weeks ago, the Sun in Leo opposed Pluto, formed a trine with Neptune, and made a sextile with Uranus, creating 3 major contacts with outer planets on the same day. That represented the lived experience itself. Something may have shifted in the way you understood yourself, your ambitions, your relationship with power, or the limits of what you were still willing to tolerate. You might have felt the change without possessing language precise enough to describe it. Now Mercury enters Leo and repeats those same 3 planetary contacts. On Tuesday, Mercury opposes Pluto. On that same Tuesday, Mercury forms a trine with Neptune. Then, on Wednesday, Mercury forms a sextile with Uranus. The Sun encountered the experience first, and Mercury follows behind as the part of consciousness capable of translating that experience into words. This is the handoff. This is the message. It does not have to appear as a notification glowing on your phone. It can be the moment when understanding finally catches up with something you have already lived through. So when we speak about the message you have been waiting for, the promise is not necessarily that someone will suddenly place a literal letter into your hands. The deeper possibility is that the pressure, realization, disruption, or internal shift you have already experienced is finally becoming something you can name. It could take the form of a decision, a confession, a resolution, an invitation, or simply that quiet internal click that reveals what a recent experience had been trying to show you from the beginning. This is why the answers seem delayed. You were not failing to understand quickly enough. The event arrived first, and language needed time to catch up with it. Cancer held the emotional reality privately, in a place where feeling could exist before explanation. Leo allows that private truth to become audible, understandable, and shareable, both to you and to other people. The letter was never missing. What you lacked was the vocabulary required to read it. The second assumption is equally important because meaningful news does not automatically mean pleasant news. Importance is not the same thing as comfort. Something can matter because it is powerful, enlarged, unexpected, revealing, or simply impossible to dismiss. The developments of this week may be beautiful and exciting, but they can also challenge you. A truth can enter your life quietly and still rearrange everything you thought was already settled. 6 days after Mercury enters Leo, on Saturday the 15th, Mercury conjuncts Jupiter, creating the clearest peak for an announcement, realization, or communication that feels unusually large in consequence or scope. Jupiter can magnify whatever Mercury communicates. A decision may suddenly carry greater implications. A door that previously seemed invisible may become apparent. A message may finally reach the audience capable of receiving it. There is genuine possibility and excitement in that contact. Yet Tuesday comes first, and on Tuesday, Mercury opposes Pluto. Pluto does not soften what it reveals, it brings hidden material into view. Under this opposition, a conversation can carry serious consequences, expose something previously concealed, or become charged with questions of influence, control, and power. That is why the message cannot be judged only by whether it feels good when it first arrives. What initially unsettles you may be the very piece that forces the deeper truth into language. And understanding that distinction is what prepares us for the next part of this story. What comes next may be the part that changes how you understand the entire message, because the truth that helps you most is not always the truth that feels easiest to receive. Something could bring you directly into contact with what an agreement, connection, relationship, or ongoing dynamic has actually become beneath the calm appearance everyone has been maintaining. That may not feel pleasant when it becomes visible, yet it could still become some of the most valuable information you receive this month. On Wednesday, Mercury forms a sextile with Uranus, on the same day as the new moon in Leo, and Uranus rarely introduces change by quietly knocking at the door and waiting for permission. Uranus interrupts the existing pattern. Information may arrive suddenly, appear through an unexpected source, or reach you through a channel you were not paying attention to. Something you considered settled could abruptly require reconsideration. A plan you believed was final may no longer look final once a missing piece becomes visible. The purpose is not cruelty. The purpose is clarity, and clarity does not always wait until you feel emotionally prepared for it. This is why the idea of translation remains so important. Some truths are difficult to express precisely because they matter so much. A faithful translator does not rewrite the original meaning merely to make the listener comfortable. The task is to find language accurate enough to carry what is actually there. Sometimes those honest words alter the emotional arrangement of an entire room. Yet saying the difficult thing clearly, without turning it into a performance, may finally release something that would otherwise continue circling silently inside you for another 2 months. So stop measuring this week by asking whether the news will be good or bad. A more useful question is whether you are prepared to hear what is genuinely being communicated. And just as importantly, are you prepared to become the person willing to say what is true? This transit is not dividing people into those who are fortunate and those who are unfortunate. The deeper division is between those who are ready and those who are not ready yet. That distinction brings us back to something important from earlier, the strange possibility that the message reaches you in the wrong order. The hardest part of this sequence may not be the final information itself. It may be what happens immediately before the meaning becomes clear. Remember the idea that the wound can appear before the explanation. Now you can see why. After Mercury enters Leo, the first exact aspect it makes is a square to Chiron in Taurus on Monday the 10th. A square creates friction, and Chiron points toward a wound that never completely stopped carrying sensitivity. This means the newly confident voice of Mercury in Leo does not immediately walk into applause. Its first encounter is with a tender place. Picture yourself finally gathering enough courage to express something important. It may be a boundary, a declaration, a truth, or something you have privately repeated for weeks. You finally say it, and then the first reaction is not what you imagined. Perhaps you meet rejection. Perhaps someone corrects you. Perhaps there is silence for just a little longer than feels comfortable. In that brief space, something much older can awaken underneath the present conversation. Suddenly, the issue is no longer only about what was just said. An older story about your value, credibility, safety, or fear of not being taken seriously begins speaking at the same time. This is one of the most emotionally delicate points in the entire sequence, because an old wound can make a present moment feel larger than it actually is. The square does not tell you that your message is wrong. It does not tell you to withdraw what you said. It also does not tell you to attack in order to protect yourself. What it reveals is that genuine confidence and defensive pride can sound almost identical to an outside listener. The real difference can only be recognized from within. You have to know which part of you is speaking. Healing here does not require perfect delivery. It requires presence. It asks whether you can say something imperfectly and remain emotionally present long enough to see how it lands. It asks whether you can feel the old wound becoming active without allowing that wound to rewrite the sentence you actually came to deliver. That may demand more courage than saying the original words, because speaking once is easier than remaining open after you have spoken. This is the deeper courage represented by Leo. It is not merely the courage to enter the room, it is the courage to remain yourself after the room responds. That is why the disorder of this message matters. Nothing has gone wrong simply because the uncomfortable part arrives first. The disorder is built into the sequence. Monday brings the wound. Tuesday brings clarity. Wednesday brings the breakthrough. The message is not damaged. It is being delivered through layers, and the most sensitive layer comes first, so that everything following it can enter a space where honesty has already replaced performance. Then the sentence you have been trying to find begins rising toward the surface. If you have felt disoriented somewhere in the middle of this process, stay with what is happening, because this is the turning point where waiting stops being passive. The sun has already carried the experience itself. Mercury now brings the language capable of describing it. What you previously could only feel is approaching the moment when it can finally become something you can communicate. On Tuesday the 11th, Mercury opposes Pluto in Aquarius, while also forming a trine with Neptune in Aries on that same day. Together, these two aspects create an unusually powerful combination. The opposition to Pluto pushes toward penetrating honesty. It can create the willingness to look beneath appearances and recognize what a conversation, relationship, agreement, or power dynamic has actually become. Pluto does not care very much about maintaining a polished surface when something important is hidden underneath it. Neptune, however, changes how that truth can be expressed. The trine to Neptune brings compassion, imagination, sensitivity, and language capable of reaching another person without unnecessarily injuring them. This is the point where honesty and beauty no longer need to function as opposites. A truthful sentence does not have to become an accusation simply because it names something difficult. Under these two influences, you may be able to recognize the uncomfortable reality while still leaving room for tenderness. You can see clearly without turning clarity into a weapon. You can acknowledge what has changed without using the truth to punish someone for changing it. This combination of penetration and compassion may be the most complete form of translation Mercury offers during the week. It allows the message to become accurate without becoming cruel. Then Wednesday the 12th brings another shift. Mercury forms a sextile with Uranus in Gemini on the same day as the new moon in Leo. A sextile to Uranus can correspond with a breakthrough, an unexpected insight, a fresh idea, or a solution that appears from a direction you were not watching. Because it occurs alongside a new moon, the information carries the feeling of a beginning. Something you articulate under this combination can contain momentum for a new creative chapter. The realization may feel liberating precisely because it interrupts the assumptions that kept you repeating the old version of the story. Yet Tuesday and Wednesday both require discernment. Neptune can make a story feel true because it is beautiful. Uranus can make an idea feel correct because it is exciting. Neither beauty nor excitement proves anything by itself. Keep the categories separate. Notice what you actually know. Notice what you are interpreting. Notice what you feel. Notice what you are asking for. Those are four different things, even when strong emotion makes them appear identical. Do not let them collapse into one another. Ask a direct question instead of constructing an interrogation around an assumption. Allow the answer to change your plan if the answer gives you a reason to change it. The message is not something to collect like a prize and display as proof that you were right. It is something to understand and then use. This brings us to the signs standing closest to the center of this sequence. 3 signs receive the strongest concentration of these aspects this week, especially when one of them is your sun sign or rising sign. That does not mean everyone else is excluded. Every sign experiences the movement of Mercury into a new sign. These 3 simply receive the most direct contact from the aspects that immediately follow. Leo, Mercury enters your sign today, joining a part of the sky where the Sun and Jupiter are already present. The new moon in Leo arrives Wednesday, and Mercury joins Jupiter on Saturday the 15th. For you, this creates the densest concentration of announcement energy in the entire window, and it falls directly across themes connected with your identity, your voice, and your name. If you have been preparing to present yourself differently, publish something, make a proposal, submit an application, or openly declare what you are building, this period supports that movement. But there is a warning hidden inside the opportunity. Confidence can help you speak, but your sense of value cannot become dependent on the first reaction you receive. Give the declaration time to exist before deciding what its reception means. The strongest statements made this week will be the ones capable of surviving questions. If a sentence collapses the moment someone asks you to explain it, then perhaps it still needs refinement. If it remains true even after being examined, then the reaction of the room does not determine its worth. Aquarius, your experience may arrive through another person, because Mercury opposes Pluto in your sign on Tuesday. A partner, client, collaborator, or someone sitting across from you may become the channel through which the message is delivered. What begins as an ordinary exchange could become far more consequential than either of you expected. The conversation may reveal an imbalance of power, an expectation that was never openly stated, or the truth about what an agreement has quietly become over time. Listen beneath the position someone presents on the surface. Try to hear what is actually being requested underneath the words. Your task is not to win through control or strategic manipulation. Your task is to answer with honesty. Gemini. Mercury is your ruling planet, and on Wednesday it forms a sextile with Uranus in your sign. Among these 3 signs, you may be the most likely to experience the news as genuinely surprising. Information can appear suddenly. A technical solution may become visible when you were not actively searching for it. A connection may open from an angle you had not considered. When the insight comes, write it down immediately, but do not confuse speed with certainty. Verify what you have received before acting on it. A breakthrough becomes far more valuable when you can turn it into a clear next step, instead of allowing it to become another source of stimulation that pulls your attention in several directions. One additional sign deserves particular care. Taurus, Mercury squares. Chiron in your sign on Monday, and this may be the most sensitive expression of the entire transit. A comment involving home, family, value, or security could touch a wound that existed long before the current conversation began. The intensity of your reaction may therefore contain more history than the present moment alone can explain. You do not have to answer a sensitive subject with rigid certainty. Give yourself time if time is needed. Clarify what was actually said before deciding what it means. Speak from the person you are now, rather than allowing the older wound to become your spokesperson. This leads to the practical question underneath everything we have been exploring. How do you read a message when you lived the experience before you had the words for it? There is something concrete you can do before these aspects fully unfold. Write one sentence. Not the speech you would give if you needed to defend yourself. Not the explanation containing every piece of context. Not the polished version designed to control how another person responds. Write the single sentence that would remain if you removed the performance, the defense, and the surrounding explanation. Find the one statement underneath all of it that still feels true. Then examine that sentence carefully and separate its components. Identify what is fact. Identify what is interpretation. Identify what is feeling. Identify what is request. These four categories disguise themselves as one another far more easily than most people realize. A feeling presented as a fact can sound like certainty when the deeper reality is fear. A request disguised as interpretation can sound like detached analysis when underneath it is a plea for something you have not directly asked for. Separating these pieces does not weaken your message. It makes the message readable. It allows you to understand what you are saying, and it gives the person who eventually receives it a better chance of understanding you as well. Once the intensity of the first part of the sequence passes, the energy changes again, and the order matters. On Thursday the 13th, Mercury forms a sextile with Venus. This is the gentlest day within the entire window. Tone becomes easier to manage. Diplomacy becomes more available. Mutual understanding has more room to develop. If an apology needs to be offered, an invitation needs to be extended, or a conversation needs warmth more than sharp precision, Thursday supports that approach. You are not abandoning the truth by speaking it gently. Sometimes the message becomes more effective precisely because it no longer has to fight its way into the room. Then, Saturday the 15th brings the larger peak. Mercury joins Jupiter in Leo, creating the strongest point for the kind of significant news toward which this entire sequence has been moving. Jupiter does not reduce the scale of what Mercury carries. Jupiter enlarges it. The reach of an announcement may expand. Something you communicate could find a wider audience. A decision may suddenly appear connected to a genuine possibility that was not obvious before. A conversation can reveal an opening that did not seem to exist the previous week. The sense of expansion is real, but expansion requires proportion. Use the confidence available to you without making the message larger than reality can support. A powerful declaration should not contain promises you cannot fulfill. Enthusiasm is useful when it gives movement to something real. It becomes dangerous when it asks the future to guarantee more than the facts can hold. Then, Monday the 17th provides the anchor at the end of this chain. Mercury forms a trine with Saturn in Aries. Saturn brings the question that every exciting possibility eventually has to answer. Can this last? Can the inspired statement survive facts, limitations, time, responsibility, and the obligations created by what has been said? If the answer is yes, then put it into writing. Document it. Commit to it. Jupiter creates possibility. Saturn defines responsibility. The message worth sending is the one capable of surviving both expansion and structure. This is where the translation reaches its final stage. For more than 2 months, a truth has moved through the private emotional language of Cancer, circling through inner corridors where you could feel it without necessarily being able to explain it. Now it is becoming ready to enter a voice that other people can actually hear. It does not need to be performed. It does not need to be aggressively defended. It does not need to disappear beneath such an elaborate story that the listener loses the central point. It simply needs to be spoken clearly, with enough courage to tolerate whatever question comes afterward. You do not have to deliver it perfectly. You do not need another person to respond in a way that proves your value. What matters is that you stop rehearsing the sentence only inside your own mind and finally allow it to exist outside you. Once the words leave that private loop, they can begin doing what language is meant to do. They can land. They can be heard. They can change the shape of something real. This is what Leo courage looks like when it is no longer dependent on applause. At its strongest, Leo courage does not demand an ovation. It turns an individual voice into something useful to a wider circle, instead of transforming that circle into an audience required to admire the speaker. The North Node in Aquarius quietly reminds you that an individual voice matters most when it strengthens something larger than itself. The words you were waiting for were never absent. They simply had not been translated yet. Cancer held the feeling. Leo provides the language. What you choose to do with that language, and with the one honest sentence beneath performance, defense, and context, remains your decision. There is still one point that deserves special attention as the week opens, because the sky immediately tests this new voice after Mercury enters Leo. Mercury squares Chiron, while Venus encounters Pluto and then moves toward an opposition with Neptune. A sensitive issue involving value can therefore rise again at the same time that you may feel tempted to idealize what another person is telling you. That combination can make hope and reality unusually easy to confuse. Let it remind you to speak gently while keeping what is actually real separate from what you merely wish were real. You do not need to rush toward an answer simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Stay with the question long enough to recognize what belongs to the present and what belongs to an older wound, what has truly been communicated, and what you have imagined around it. If something in this has touched the sentence you have been privately repeating, notice what has finally become possible to say. You can share that one true line in the comments, or simply name what has become speakable after remaining silent for so long. Subscribe if this feels like the right place to continue these conversations, and we will meet again in the next one.